But we have the absolute pleasure of having been able to speak to Geoff Downes directly about his new album on DBA3. So let's go over to that now. I'm delighted to say that Geoff Downes is with us again this week. Fantastic to see him again. And we're going to talk about Skyscraper Souls, DBA3. So that's the Downes Braid Association's third album. So, Geoff, this album is definitely from the same band as your previous ones. There's definitely a DBA style, I think, but it also feels like a progression. Now, was that deliberate?
I think so. I think we didn't feel that we're standing still, but I think we took the original concept as far as we could, which was really just the two of us in terms of performance, and everything was geared around the two of us. It was a bit like the Buggles kind of concept, yes. And two guys making electronic music and, with catchy pop songs, I suppose, was the idea behind it. But I think that when we got stuck into this album, it was very much a case of we'd like to have expand that idea and getting some some live performers on there was something that I think opened it all up, and I think it opened what we were trying to do up, and certainly having the extended song at the front of Skyscraper Souls, it's very much like a sort of progressive pop epic, which was what we were really aiming for, was an expanded song along the lines of War of the Worlds or Tubular Bells, something that went through a lot of different changes, a lot of permutations, and with those recurrent themes coming back. I'm very proud of the way the album turned out, actually, because I think it's got a lot of melody to it. It's got a lot of hooks in there. That's what we were really aiming for, and so it's a very moody album. I think it's got a lot of great sections to it. And having these guest performers come on was really the icing on the cake as far as we were concerned. Yeah. Obviously, people like Kate Pearson and Mark Armand. These are all things that really very much artists that Chris was really into, certainly XTC, bands like that. The Buggles was something that was Chris's favourite band ever, So it's kind of nice that we got that, we managed to capture those performances from people, and I think they've really added to the whole album.
Yeah, I have to say, I really, really enjoyed this record. I've really found myself listening to it repeatedly over the last couple of days. Skyscraper Souls in particular, the song itself, I think that song and the first song just go together so beautifully together. And it's an amazing piece of epic length work. What's the attraction of longer form pieces?
Well, I think we didn't want to be restricted. I think on the previous couple of albums, we'd built on our own restrictions in terms of, we'd write the song and it would be just a collection of songs. The album would be, that was the way that we approached it. And I think that it gave us the opportunity to stretch out more rather than having this framework of just writing pop songs, which, it's very... Chris himself is very proficient at. He's got an amazing track record of writing pop songs. And I think from his standpoint, he wanted to stretch out a bit on this album and maybe do something that was a bit more, not meaningful, but enabled us to really do what we wanted to and without any kind of brief or anything like that. And I think this album epitomizes what we set out to achieve.
Yeah, so there are those recurring themes there, and it's really enjoyable hearing those coming back through quite a few of the songs. So is part of it that you're deliberately trying to encourage a kind of return to whole album listening rather than the current single track obsession?
Well, it's interesting that, because Chris is a huge vinyl fan,
right.
And certainly we both got back in, I certainly got back into vinyl a few years ago, and I think we did conceive it more as a double-sided album. I think that it's a shame these days that tracks get cherry-picked off albums, and the whole concept of writing an album and music to capture a particular time is sort of fallen by the wayside. So in this instance, it's very much a vinyl-inspired album in terms of you have the long song on one side and and the shorter songs on the other. Yes. I suppose if you look at Close to the Edge was a bit like that, where the entire side of one album was one side. So it's it's an interesting turn on that, and particularly in the context of what we're doing, which is very much a sort of pop basis, but at the same time as that slightly off the wall view of things, and it's not just a normal pop record. It's something more, or at least hopefully something more than that.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you mentioned the whole vinyl record thing. I'm a huge vinyl collector too, and love the return to vinyl. And speaking of the return to vinyl, one of the great things that we get with vinyl return is the great artwork that we get to see on the front covers again. And with Roger Dean doing your cover, which is fantastic, was that part of the deliberate development of the music to move in a more progressive direction?
Yeah, I think we wanted to expand that side of it as well. And I think the visual... I mean, I've been involved with Roger for years, as you know, decades. And I thought it was a nice idea that, bearing in mind what we were aiming for, that with this more progressive streak, if you like, that this would be reflected in the cover and the artwork and everything. And Roger, it's certainly not one of his most intense pieces of work, but I think that it carries the feeling of what we're trying to achieve. It gets that feeling over, and so I was very happy that he could come on board and take it on. And he's always very good. He always comes up with something a bit different, and that's great. He's a really good guy, and I always get on with him. And I did a show with him last year actually, where we did a Q&A thing, and it was really, really interesting.
So a couple more questions then, and it's great to see, as you've already mentioned, the level of collaboration again on this album. And I did love the narration, which was very much reminiscent of War of the Worlds, etc. But did you actually get a chance to work directly with some of these people rather than the current trend of working remotely and sending files?
No, it's mainly remotely. It's certainly, I think Chris had the opportunity of working with some of the people because they were based in the States, but I kind of let him run with the ball really on that, and I think that he was really sending the files over to people and saying, let's do this. So certainly that seems to be the way that music has gone these days. Certainly for collaborative projects such as that. But I'm not saying that if we were to do another Yes album, for instance, it would be the same approach on that. I think there's a lot to be said still for that, working arrangements out in the studio and putting them together that way. And I think that's sometimes how you come up with something a bit different. But certainly in this instance, I think that the concept worked very well, and in fact the musicians who played on it did take it in a very different direction and added a lot to it from an influential standpoint.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because our final patron question's from Preston Frazier, and he was asking really about that, and he wants to know about the writing process. You've already said something about that there. Perhaps you can just expand slightly on that and how it actually worked, and whether that's different from your writing process with Asia or Yes.
Certainly, it's a different idea. I mean, I just assemble a lot of various little tracks and things like that, and then send them over to Chris, and that was how that worked. Of course, when I used to write with John Wetton, it was very much a case of us just sitting around and working together around a piano or something like that. That was really a wholly different approach. So I think that there are different ways of creating music, and I'm fortunate that there's three options that I've given you there. For instance, you've got the sitting down around a piano, you've got the sending remote files, or you've got sitting in a studio and working it together with a band. There are different ways of making music, but I think that sort of pretty much sums it up.
Yeah. All right. So thank you very much indeed, Geoff. Great to talk to you. Speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Okay, bye.
I've heard all Yes Music podcast every week. I love to hear what Kevin says. I've heard all Yes Music podcasts every week. I love to hear what Kevin says.
So just before we go, here's the patron update for this week. Eddie Offord patrons are Jeffrey Cuselius, Preston Frazier, Bill Govier, Wayne Hall and Michelle Arsenault. Time and Word patrons are Joseph Cottrell, Michael O'Connor, Paul Tomei, Jeffrey Mason, Lobate Scarp, Fergus Cubbage, Robert Nazir, and Steve Dill. And yes, patrons are Paul Wilson, Jamie McQuinn, Miguel Falcao, Ken Fuller, David Pannell, Joost Maglev, Brian Sullivan, Jeremy North, Tim Stannard, Dave Watkinson, Steve Raw, Jeff Bailey, William Hayes, and also continued thanks to Robert. If you'd like to join those patrons in supporting the show, then just head over to Patreon, patreon.com/yesmusicpodcast. So that's about all the time we have this week. Thanks so much for listening once again. Wasn't it great to have Geoff on the show again this week? Before next week, if you'd like to get involved yourself, and please do, then you can follow the show on Twitter, on Facebook, or on Instagram. And you can drop a line to show@yesmusicpodcast.com. So until next week, just remember, whatever your progressive rock question, the answer is yes.